Hi gang, the Nachmund Gauntlet is a vital strategic area of the 40k galaxy, one of the few stable routes through the Great Rift, and a major war zone for the last 3 editions of the game, fought over in multiple different wars by almost every faction in the universe. In fact, the story is still being told in the most recent Crusade supplements. But to explain that fully, we need to begin at the dawn of the Dark Imperium on the isolated planet of Vigilus with the War of Beasts. Get more Arbiting at Arbitarian's Precinct House with Book Club and Tale of Four Gamers, link below. The Nachmund Gauntlet is one of the most contested war zones in the 40k universe, a rare, stable corridor through the Great Rift that bisects the galaxy, fought over by Imperial, Chaos and Xenos forces in a series of massive wars raging for decades. For the Imperium, it's one of the few stable routes from Imperium Sanctus to Imperium Nihilus, and the slim hope of retaining control over the northern side of the galaxy. For Chaos, it's a flaw in an otherwise perfect bisection of that galaxy, a gap in their defences that needs to be eliminated. And that means that for the planets within it, their sleepy, forgotten backwater of the galaxy has suddenly become a raging war zone, drawing the attention of every faction in the 41st millennium, almost. And I should probably tell that story. The original inspiration for this video series you're about to watch came from this book, kindly sent to me by the nice people at Games Workshop, Nachmund Gauntlet, the Crusade supplement for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. And when I usually do these videos, I run through the book, summarise all the lore developments, explaining where that leaves the galaxy, hopefully without too much conjecture or rumour mongering, and try and get that out by the release date. But the Nachmund Gauntlet is a little different because the story, the thing to summarise, is really big. The Nachmund Gauntlet has been a main location for the wars of Warhammer 40,000 for about 3 editions of the game now. If you're new to 40k, the way this tends to work is that while there is like a big plot that very slowly advances kind of once an edition, in reality the galaxy is divided up into a number of settings for much smaller stories. At any time, the action tends to concentrate on a number of specific war zones, which are all happening at the same time, and they all slowly unfold over years and years, and within those massive war zones, smaller battles, missions, novels and stories are told. The defense against Hive Fleet Leviathan in the Bastion sector, the infighting amongst the Necrons in the Pariah Nexus, the movements of the Indomitus Crusade. All of those are settings in their own right in which stories and animations, video games and tabletop games are all set. And over time, one will slowly wind up while another one suddenly opens. The Nachmund Gauntlet has been one of those active war zones since the start of 8th edition 40k back in 2017, and its story covers the War of Beasts, no, not that one, the other one, and then the War of Nightmares, both which happened on the planet of Vigilus, through to different wars that happened throughout the Gauntlet in 9th edition, all the way up to the current deployment of the Sanctus Wall and the battles at Sangua Terra in 10th edition. And I've covered none of them. Not a word, really. And all these books are pretty dense, they're packed with information as the war spreads across an entire sector and more. So instead of getting one update video for the release of this book, now quite a while ago, I thought I'd just do the whole story in as many videos as that takes, possibly 5 at this point, because all those books deal with pretty distinct wars, all of which have really nice handy names for a thumbnail. We'll start with the War of Beasts, the initial conflict on the isolated world of Vigilus at the opening of the Great Rift, not to be confused with the War of the Beast, which is a totally different war that happened millennia before. Not confusing at all. They did both feature orcs though. From this initial story, just like the War Master himself, we can get our greasy mitts on the whole of Nachmund Gauntlet. The prominence of the world of Vigilus really starts with the destruction of the world of Cadia and the formation of the Great Rift. Before the dawn of this new era, Vigilus had been a productive, if slightly haphazard, Imperial hive world. Orbiting the star Astra Vigila, Vigilus was the primary planet in the Vigilus system, a small system whose other holdings included the industrial world of Nachmund Gauntlet and its cathedral moon of Hearthlack, the death world of Falsehood, and the mining colony of Geotrope. Vigilus itself was orbited by just a single satellite, the administratum moon of Neo Velum, that housed all its astropath stations, and outside that, a significant icy asteroid belt. Vigilus was a dry, dusty world of open plains and expansive desert seas, where industry was concentrated into a number of false continents that rose from the Dust Bowl, massive hive sprawls, each of which contained innumerable city hives, all linked together, with trade convoys tracking through the desolate wastes to keep any industry running. It was ruled from the capital spires, the palace of Saints Haven, within the massive Hyperia hive sprawl by the Agamemnus family, who presided over the Aquilarian Council, which was comprised of the various controlling interests that fed the hive sprawls, each of which had a bit of a different speciality. Otech hive sprawl was famous for water treatment and purification, a massive issue on the dusty world, whereas the frozen southern area of Calgar, Spain was mined for drinkable water. Dontoria hive sprawl was a hub for off-world shipping. Mortwald controlled food and medicine production, and the massive Mega Borealis was the industrial hub, a forge continent ruled over by the adepts of the Mechanicus from the forge world of Styges. Though the world was ancient and contained many hives and spires that scraped low orbit, Mega Borealis was also home to the Omniscient Hoist, the very largest of those, a gigantic space elevator and freight transporter that connected with the orbiting station of Sacras Tora Hawking. From there, ice water that was mined from the nearby Octoline asteroid belt could be ferried down to supply the population. Outside the false continents of the hive sprawls was a sea of dust, endless wastes, an environment inimical to life, not because of any particular poison or compound, but just because they were devoid of any plant life and had a water table so low as to be inaccessible. They'd never been conquered and were littered with the bones of those that had tried, instead merely forming dust bowls that acted like the oceans of other worlds, inhabited by strange predators and scoured by periodic dust storms. The greatest of those was known as the Vulian Swirl, a permanent storm of dust, rocks, and sharp shredding particles in the deep wastes that have been raging for centuries and dominated almost a quarter of the planet's surface on the barren side of the planet, known as the Dismal Waste. Industry and exploration had occasionally attempted to penetrate the Dismal Waste and the edge of the swirl, but none had really ever succeeded. Before the opening of the rift, the main tensions on the planet had been the same as on many other Imperial planets, the competing political interests of the various factions in the Aquilarian Council and the occasional Xenos raider. The Mechanicus held an oversized presence on the Council that they termed the Council of Cogs, since the planet held the STC for a rare pattern of psi-reactive force field, examples of which protected the hive sprawls from any attack from the wastes. But recently, their deep excavations on their continent, jealously guarded from the rest of the planet, had led to increased pollution in the water table, something that threatened the entire world. The Adeptus Ministorum had been gaining political power on the planet for years, infiltrating both the ruling dynasty and the Vigilant Guard, the planet's PDF, with their own faithful in the hope of becoming leading voices on the council. Significant forces from the Order of Our Martyred Lady had garrisoned Saints Havens since way back when it was a single basilica, and the growing influence of the church was stubbornly resisted by all the other powers. And of course, there were the usual problems with isolated raiders. The Xenos Drukhari had been seen operating from the frozen continent of Calgar, Spain, and disrupting water mining in recent years, which is crazy because the Dark Eldar aren't exactly known for sensible cold weather clothing. Anyway, it was all the current ruler, Lucien Agamemnus, could do to hold on to power amongst the bickering interests of the council, and many viewed her ruling dynasty as rulers only in name. But when Cadia fell and the Great Rift spread across the stars, Vigilus was surprised to find itself at the northern end of what became termed the Nachmund Gauntlet, a relatively stable corridor of real space that bisected the rift. One of only two navigable corridors linking the southern side of the galaxy, Imperium Sanctus, with the isolated northern side, the Dark Imperium of Imperium Nihilus. Vigilus was situated at the mouth of the Nihilus end, its opposite number being Sangua Terra on the Sanctus end, and in between were a string of worlds that either remained Imperial, fell to the rift, or struck out on their own. The night world of Darovar was one such independent, attacking anyone who came near, to the point that eventually the planet's king, Calgar, was declared a traitor to the Imperium. In the chaotic years following the rift, Vigilus became a vital bastion for Imperial forces escaping its ravages. Many regiments from Cadia and the surrounds had found themselves redirected there in the wake of its fall, in an event known as the Pre-Tempestine Exodus. But as the rift continued to spread, it caused even more problems. The appearance of the rift in the sky above the planet led to waves of panic and the inevitable rising of dark cults. Like on many planets, martial law was instituted, its citizens forbidden from looking at the night sky. Strange signs and sigils were seen. Mildew on the walls of ancient aquifers grew in symbols of chaos, or mirrored the shape of the rift itself. And the security forces were already struggling to keep order when the first invaders struck. The initial spread of the Great Rift had led to the Noctis Eterna, a great silencing of Psi Augurs that left the Imperium blind, and in the darkness the astropaths of Neovellum didn't see the massive Ork armada bearing down on them until it was too late. The kill cruisers of the Orks smashed through the thin Imperial battle fleet defending the planet, catching them unawares, and many simply crash-landed in the desert wastes, their hulls becoming the centre for newly constructed scrap cities as the Ork mechs, always adaptable, figured out how to use the waste to their advantage. Soon, thousands of ramshackle Ork vehicles were being manufactured out in the deep waste from the wrecked ships, an invasion swarm named the Speedwar, led by the Speed Lord Supreme, Cruel Daka. Great plumes of dust were seen as almost all of the hive sprawls came under attack at once. Initially, the great force fields that surrounded the hive sprawls kept the Orks at bay, the speed freaks constantly probing forward to see how close they could get to the sprawls' outer defences, but the spread of the rift interfered with the psi-active technology of the fields, and the defences started to fail sporadically. The Orks would leap upon each failure immediately, charging towards the hive sprawl's outskirts as the beleaguered vigilant guard stood ready to repel, and war broke out on the outskirts of the sprawls across the planet. But they weren't the only Xenos attackers to reveal themselves. Centuries before, the gene-stealer cult of the Pauper Princes had seeded Vigilus, their cultists stowing away on merchant ships that had left chance as veil, and elements of that cult, under the elusive patriarch Grandsire Worm, were active in the depths of the sprawls, and they chose the confusion of the Ork Speedwar to rise up. The underdeveloped Dirkden hive sprawl was the first to feel the effects, as their saboteurs caused the shutdown of even more force fields, and then their infiltrators in the top ranks of the Vigilant Guard ordered the defenders out into the wastes in force, a sally against the Orks. Once thousands of loyal soldiers were marching past the defence lines, the cult raised the shields again, trapping them in the wastes and then seizing control of much of the sprawl in a coup. Panicked loyal citizens spread across thin land bridges to other hives, but this only allowed the cult to spread further. And then in Otek hive sprawl, the cult seized control of the hollows, vast reservoirs, and then started to pollute the water within with their horrible stolen genes, probably. By the time the first Imperial reinforcements arrived, the planet was in disarray, its rulers closing ranks and pulling back forces to defend themselves. The Mechanicus at Mega Borealis withdrew long-range mining operations from Calax Bane, and the Aquilarian Council had tried to send forces to relieve the Forge complex, But it wasn't enough. A whole spire had been toppled, forming a bridge into the hive that was dared by the speed freaks, and the Magi had set entire chemical lakes alight to form a fiery barrier, but the Orks just kept coming. In the deserts, armoured PDF columns and Valkyrie flights loaded with Tempestus Scions duelled with speeding Ork vehicles, and in the deep hive areas, the Vigilant Guard were ambushed by the acolytes of the Pauper Princes as the cult came out of hiding. Eventually, looking to their own safety, the Council pulled back most of the PDF to Saints Haven, and industry on the planet shut down as the trade caravans ground to a halt. The closest the planet had to a coordinated response was overseen by the Order of Our Martyred Lady, since the Ministorum had power bases in every one of the hive sprawls. Their commander, the fiery and short-tempered canoness Temperance Blaze, was given free rein by the Council to prosecute the war as she saw fit, and deployments of battle sisters were essential in the early days, leading counterattacks against Ork forces and providing a visible rallying point for the faithful citizenry. Blaze personally leading sallies into the underhives of the sprawls and authorising a massive deployment of battle sisters to try and protect the water storage hollows of Otek hive sprawl from Genestealer attack. Mega Borealis then suffered further as its ruling Magos, Epluvian 14, was paralysed staring at the rift, attempting to calculate what exactly it was. The mental feedback loops he suffered froze Skitarii and Legio assets across the hive complex, and the Genestealer cult took advantage of the paralysis, stealing a Vortex missile and then detonating it deep within Hive Scellerus, the ruling spire of the Forge continent, destroying the warlord titan Dominus Rex. It wasn't until Archmagos Kaldrike seized control of the network that the Mechanicus of Mega Borealis started to fight back in coordination with some new arrivals. The first reinforcements to arrive at Vigilus were the Iron Hands, along with their successor chapter, the Brazen Claws, translating in force under the command of the Iron Hands chapter master, Cardan Stronos. Operating with their usual clinical efficiency, their calculations circumventing the worst of the warp squalls out of system, they fell on the remains of the Ork fleet in orbit and pushed it aside, commencing a full drop pod deployment to shore up the defences of the sprawls. Astartes deploying directly to the fringes and fortifying the Vigilant Guard against Ork raiders. Clan Cargill deployed in full to Mega Borealis, and assisted by the Skitarii maniples of the Forge, they descended into the depths to hunt down the Genestealers. The Brazen Claws concentrated on Hyperia and its war against the Speedwar, while smaller Space Marine detachments continued to filter in system, redirected by the growing rift. The Space Wolves of Ragnar Blackmane's Great Company chose Otek Hive Sprawl as their hunting ground, tracking elements of the cults deep into the underhives, breaking through any ambushes with sheer fury. Primaris battle leader Haldor Icepelt was the first to locate the poisoning of Gregan Hollow and ended up collapsing the macro ducts that linked it to the rest of the hive water systems to try and stop the spread of all those evil stolen genes. 2 of the 5 great hollows would eventually be declared condemned in their wake. And that wasn't the only incident of dodgy pollution. During the chaos, a mysterious ship had put down at the shipyards of the overcrowded Dontoria hive. At Litmus Dock, broadcasting old codes that apparently still checked out, a rusted hulk put down with the minimum of communication. But when the ramps of the ship lowered, it wasn't a reinforcing army or terrified refugees that emerged, but hideously twisted, shambling mutants and a detachment of the Death Guard Chaos Space Marines. The local Tempestus Scions forces and Adeptus Arbites tried to contain the incursion, but the servants of Nurgle were quickly lost in the stinking depths of Dontoria. After a series of running battles, the commander, Tempesta Naiad of the 98th Lambdic Oxen, eventually just ordered the lower levels of the hive firebombed within a 2-mile radius and considered the minor incursion closed. But in the weeks after, sickness spread. Plague was common in the overcrowded slums of Dontoria, but this new strain spread like wildfire and mutated those it touched. Whole gangs of chaos worshippers rising in the darkness, calling themselves Twisted Lords. Arbites and Scion Purge teams fought them where they could, but only one person successfully identified the strain. The rogue trader, Delaric du Longueuil, resident in the spires at Dontoria at the time, correctly identified the new sickness as the warp-borne disease the Gellerpox. In addition to this, and because there just aren't enough factions involved already, this is an 8th edition supplement, remember, the Eldari decided to get involved. Farseer Keltok of Saimhan had predicted that despite their own issues with the Monkey, Vigilus probably was essential in stopping the dominion of chaos over the galaxy. Particularly, they had seen that Vigilus would fall unless a particular strand of fate was averted. The chaos cult demagogue, Vanadan the Firebrand, had risen in the industrial Storval hive sprawl and then spread his influence into Hyperia. The Farseer foresaw that if his plans to ignite the forges of Storval bore fruit, the resulting chain of explosions would destroy Saints Haven, removing any chance at a coordinated resistance and then damning the planet. With this in mind, Saimhan dispatched the Autarch Rylor of Clan Moirek and his relative, the Spirit Seer Quelinaris. Their mounted task force emerged from the webway at Kalak's Bane, swiftly closing on Hyperia and locating and eliminating the demagogue, but the attack reverberated through the Imperial alert systems. Seeing this as just another attack by the terrifying Eldar raiders down at Kalak's Bane, Hive Command retaliated in force, and Tempestus Scions from the 47th Antral Lions deployed into the area. Quelinaris attempted to parley, to explain that they just removed a threat, but the Scions of course just opened fire, killing Autarch Rylor and forcing the furious Eldari to retreat. None of that helped the level of confusion currently endemic at Hive Command. Despite the planet being reinforced by disparate Space Marine forces, none of them were particularly fond of coordinating with the other or with their Astra Militarum counterparts. The Iron Hands had success with their regular allies in the Mechanicus, but to many of the new Space Marine commanders, the ruling council were less than useless and barely worth talking to. Their only common ally was Canoness Blaze of the Sisterhood, who had considerable local knowledge and whose armies were an effective fighting force, but even despite that, the Ministorum and the Adeptus Astartes have never been the closest of allies, and many of the Astartes commanders chose their own objectives as and when threats occurred. Those Space Marine forces had also been sending signals for reinforcement all this time. They hadn't planned to end up fighting their war on Vigilus, and in many cases they were far from their homeworlds. The closing Noctis Eterna made communication extremely difficult, but eventually some messages did get through, and it was through that the Imperium on the Sanctus side, still reeling from the rift, learned of the War of Beasts, the Gauntlet, and the perilous state of Vigilus. When the recently returned Primarch Robute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, finally heard of the situation, organised reinforcements were arranged. En route to Vanatix 9, the Chapter Master of the Ultramarines, Marnius Calgar, received an urgent telepathic communication from the chapter's chief librarian, Varro Tigurius. Guilliman had declared Vigilus essential. It could not be allowed to fall. Calgar was redirected to take control and quickly assembled a strike force from the new Primaris chapters under his command and set off through the gauntlet. The combined librarians and mortal psychers of the chapter pooled their resources in a massive effort to guide this new fleet through the tortured warp space, many astropaths and navigators dying to the strain, but eventually the fleet made it through the storms and arrived in orbit of the planet. A second drop pod assault commenced, but this one was meticulously planned. Heavy strike forces from multiple chapters liaised with their counterparts in the Vigilant Guard to reinforce key areas against the Orks. Vanguard strike forces deployed to hunt cultists in the depths, and while the counterattack began, Calgar himself went directly to Saints Haven and marched into the chamber of the Aquilarian Council. Pointing a finger of accusation at the members of the council he believed to be traitors to the war effort, Calgar bade his shield brothers round up and remove those he found wanting. One of those malcontents, roughly seized, was exposed to have purplish knobbly skin under his collar, well concealed by grease paint, but stark when revealed. Another cultist was uncovered soon after, coming to the aid of his fellow with a knife drawn from the flesh of his forearm. Seeing that the council had been infiltrated by the members of the cult, Calgar opened fire, killing many of the infected councillors. The planetary governor, Agamemnus, was spared, but from that point there was to be a new government running the war on Vigilus, the Vigilus Senate, this time under the sole control of Marneus Calgar. The Senate quickly moved to reorganize the defense of the planet, all under the strategic guidance of Calgar. Heeding the words of the rogue trader Longwheel, who had been largely ignored by the Old Council, the Necropolis Hawks and Crimson Fist chapters enacted the Dontorian Firewall. The Necropolis Hawks, experts in city fighting, descended into the plague-ridden Hivesprawl to eliminate the worst of the tainted lords. Their intercessors blasted their foes back in overlapping fields of bolt fire, while Hellblasters incinerated all the larger mutants. With fury and discipline, they corralled the milling Gellerpox mutants, hunting down their leaders as the Crimson Fists drew the cordon tight. Around the hive, Crimson Fist's Redeemers and the Hellhounds of the Vigilant Guard burned the outskirts clean of life, hundreds of thousands of innocents dying in the fires so that the Gellerpox would remain contained. At the same time, Delarique du Longueuil conducted her own interdiction mission. Before the shutdown of Dontoria, a ship had been recorded leaving the Hivesprawl and was en route to the Mandeville point at the edge of the system. The bulk freighter, Illustrious Cargo, was a potential biological time bomb, likely to be carrying the infected, and it was 3 days out on its journey already. Only du Longueuil's personal yacht, the Messenger, could reach it in time. Within hours, the ship was streaking through the void on coordinates supplied by the data engines of Neovellum. The Messenger was no heavily armed warship, and so the freighter would need to be disabled from within. The rogue trader personally leading her teams of breachers and armsmen into the haunted depths. No records exist of the battles that happened in the corrupted freighter or the horrors that lurk within, but only du Longueuil returned, her breachers killed to a man, and the Illustrious Cargo exploding just short of the Mandeville point. Unfortunately, it was then discovered that 2 others had taken off too, so Calgar had formed an elite guard unit, the Extremist Guard, led by the veteran Ultramarines Lieutenant Eothrus, to safeguard this new Vigilus Senate from any more rebel attacks, but one of their most significant actions would not be against cultists, but against yet more Xenos. The Spirit Seer Qualinaris had returned to his clan holdings on Samhan, and, with no higher authorization, woken the constructs of his clan and led them back to Vigilus to avenge the death of his kinsman, Autarch Rylor. The Aquilarian Council would pay for their grave insult, and the Spirit Seer launched a surprise attack on Saints Haven, but this time he was met not by the guards of the Aquilarian Council or Tempestus Scions, but by Lieutenant Eothrus and his Extremist Guard. This time it was the Lieutenant who attempted to parley. He'd heard from Halder Icepelt that the warriors of Samhan were honourable and could be reasoned with, but the enraged Spirit Seer only responded with a hail of fire. It was only when the doors to the new Senate opened and 4 chapter masters marched out in response, accompanied by their honour guard, that the Eldari were forced to retreat once again into the depths of Hyperia Hivesprawl. Outside the capital, the planet was slowly being brought back into control, but it would be at Mortwald where the first real Imperial counterattack would be made. Mortwald Hivesprawl was the centre of food and medicine production on the planet, ruled over by the brother of the planetary governor, Dinos Agamemnus. It was heavily fortified by a massive northern trench network and row of fortifications, improved in recent years by the arrival of many of those Astra Militarum regiments fleeing the Rift. In recent months it had come under sustained attack by the orcs of the Tanker Spill Scrap City, but those attacks had largely been repulsed. The Astra Militarum defenders, well dug in, were reinforced by the 5th Company of the Imperial Fists under Captain Fane, the Knights of House Terran, a group of Freeblade Knights from Daravar, and even Maniples of Titans, the Reaver Heresium Bane and its Warhound escorts, the Hyperion Hounds. Up until this point, and under protest in the case of the impetuous Freeblades of Daravar, the Imperial forces had steadfastly remained behind their shields, obeying the standard orders of Dinos Agamemnus, content to annihilate the ramshackle forces of the orcs from afar. But over time, the construction of larger and larger orc vehicles had pressed the line significantly. To the east of Mortwald was a region filled with some of the most belligerent scrap cities, the closest being Tanker Spill, the fortress of the orc boss mech, Big Tanker. The Big Tanker was locked in a constant struggle against his rival, big mech Drozgot of the nearby Drozgot's crater to impress the big boss of the whole war, Kruldacker, whose base was at Fort Dacker further to the east. Unlike Kruldacker, who led the Speed War from a fleet of fast vehicles, or Drozgot, who commanded a legion of Stormboys flying around on swift rocket packs, the big tanker favoured size and strength over speed, and Tanker Spill was devoted to the construction of massive walkers. The big tankers, stompers and gargants waddled into battle, supported by a rig fleet of over 50 battle tankers, vast fuel drums strapped to their beds that allowed them to refuel their super heavy charges on the go. When the Hive Sprawl came under attack by waves of stompers from Tanker Spill, the trench lines were pressed like never before. After enduring attack after attack from Big Tanker, it was the Imperial Fist Captain Fane who decided to signal the advance and let his own war machines off their leash. Ignoring the orders of the Hive's ruler, he sounded the advance, and the Knights of Daravar and Terran, with swift-moving Astartes support in the form of elements of the White Scars and the Dark Angels, raced across the wastes, eventually assaulting and destroying Tanker Spill. However, unable to stop themselves, the frenzied Freeblades of Daravar kept moving, spreading through those nearby scrap cities and attacking Runthive, Drozgot's crater, and eventually Fort Dacker itself. Taking advantage of the temporary Ork confusion, and with Aeronautica spotters relaying their movements, the White Scars leader, Olugin Khan, masterminded a multi-pronged assault. His forces had landed north of the scrap cities, and they'd been harassing the Orcs since they arrived, and he used the charge of the Knights of Daravar as a distraction, his companies speeding into battle and killing thousands of Orcs across the 4 scrap cities. He was aided in this by the swift-moving assets of the Dark Angels, who'd accompanied the White Scars into battle on speeders and bikes, covering their initial charges against the enemy. But as the Imperial counterattack spread outward, the Dark Angels started acting very strangely, veering off away from the battle and then heading east across the desert towards the giant permanent dust storm of the Vulian Swirl. As the battle reached its crescendo, the Khan found himself abandoned by his allies, his forces overextended, and he was forced to retreat back into the wastes as the final Freeblades died, surrounded by whooping Orc vehicles. However, the reclamation of Vigilus had at least begun. The assaults against the central cluster of scrap cities and the reinforcement of the outlying hive districts had managed to contain the Orc threat for the time being. A Genestealer cult attack led by the secretive Grandsire Worm had managed to take control of the Omniscient Hoist, the great space elevator that linked with the Orbitan space station, supplying fresh water, and the loss of that water was a blow, but apart from that mishap, cult activities across the planet had at least been suppressed. The kill teams, battle sisters and Astartes strike forces foiling the worst of the cult's plans, and the wider Imperial forces pulled back and cordoned Dirkden Hive Sprawl. And with the forces of the Plague Gods seemingly contained to Dontoria Hive by the well-maintained Dontoria firewall, the Imperials had begun to think they'd endured the worst. But, as always in Warhammer, the worst was still to come. The rift became agitated as it continued its spread across the galaxy. Strange creatures of shadow were seen in the highest of the spires, crackling energies playing between the hive tops. The Psyker prophets of the ruling powers claimed that their readings of the Emperor's Tarot were turning up the same cards over and over again. That of the Demon Blade, crossed with the Herald of Darkness and the Knight of the Abyss. And only when the engine flares of a vast chaos fleet lit in the skies above the planet did they realise the magnitude of their error. The War of Beasts may have been over, contained for now by the organisation of Calgar, but the War of Nightmares was about to begin. And that's the first stage of the story, as detailed in the Vigilus Defiant campaign book, the very first campaign book of 8th edition Warhammer, which is up on the Warhammer Vault if you want to read it in more detail. The book's actually huge. There's 100 pages of lore on all the different forces, and since this is the first campaign book of a whole new edition, you can see how they've tried to include most of the different armies in the game. It's actually a bit confusing trying to piece everything together in the correct order. There are so many factions factions doing so many things with so many little box outs that a solid timeline of events would have been really useful. But then that's a theme of the modern 40k setting. They don't really do dates anymore. Games Workshop obviously tried to include most of the game modes in this too. Unlike a lot of earlier campaigns, this is full of not only great big tank battles or infantry conflicts, but also loads of excuses to fight small skirmishes and tense kill team style underground wars. And that's really useful for 8th edition, which brought in a massive influx of new players who maybe didn't have very big armies yet. The story can get a bit confusing, but the intention here was obviously to try and get as many people involved and on board with the new narrative direction in 40k. In the next book, things become even more confusing though, as Chaos gets involved, which is of course about 11 different factions on its own. And our story spreads out across the whole 40k landscape, not in just a single campaign book, but through some of the other box sets as well. But for now, thanks for watching. And if you'd like to follow this series, well, like and subscribe and you'll probably get notifications. And check below for details of the Patreon, the YouTube membership scheme, the merch store, and of course, the second channel. See ya!